Alright, hello YouTubes, back at you with another video, yet another one, yes. And this time I'm going to be talking about one of the more controversial aspects of Tekken 8. And for once, I'm not going to be talking about the system itself, or the way the game exists within our fighting game market, or even the changes they've made to Tekken as a sort of Tekken's image as a franchise and as a fighting game. But I'm going to talk specifically about a character. Today I'm going to be talking about Dragunov. In order to answer the question of exactly why Dragunov is so powerful and such a menace in Tekken 8 today, I had to go back into the past and boot up my legally acquired emulated copies of previous Tekken games yet again, in order to experiment with the character and figure out what makes him tick, as well as what the original image for the character was, because Dragunov wasn't always this chip damage dealing, high pressure Goliath with powerful lows. He evolved into that. So I need to see what transition period came between Tekken 5 and Tekken 8 to create what he is today. Now, Dragunov in Tekken 5 is pretty underwhelming as a character. He performs poorly on many different avenues, and that's because it's very easy to get around any potential pressure or whatever potential threat he's trying to actually push upon his opponent. He's extremely weak to sidestep left, and many of his strings have gaps that are easy to exploit even for the larger characters just by moving to the sides. This weakness to sidestep left is a bit of a legacy weakness he carries with him through the entirety of his existence in Tekken, but it is egregious in Tekken 5, and you can see me playing examples of this in the background. This is more or less just the tip of the iceberg in terms of just how linear he actually is in Tekken 5. Another issue that Dragunov has in Tekken 5 is many of his moves lack the same impact or oomph they have in future games. His running 2 is a little bit limp-wristed, and I don't mean that as some kind of slur. It legitimately looks extremely weak. Other moves like back 4-3 and back 2-1 don't have the same impact they do because they're significantly slower than they are in future games. Looking at his back 2-1 now in comparison to what it once was, and I can see why people wouldn't be too big on the character despite his initially very cool design and his very menacing aura. His moves just do not sell him as a character in Tekken 5. So at this point, after I've had so many of these examples playing in the background, I do need to make the admission that Tekken 5 is a more movement-focused game, and sidestepping in that game is better than in any of the future entries, partially because of the lack of homing moves, as in explicit moves that are created to track a sidestepping opponent, but also just because the game sidesteps cover more distance in general. Now, the exceptions in Dragunov's toolkit, like back 4-2 not tracking, or back 4-2-1 not tracking, or back 3-1 not tracking, those are exceptional weaknesses and exceptional gaps in Dragunov's kit. Those aren't justified by the game being more sidestep oriented. Alright, so now it's about time for me to wrap up the Tekken 5 portion of this Dragunov analysis. So, going with Tekken 5 Dragunov, he has a lot of weaknesses and very few strengths to actually pull from in order to make a functional game plan with him. He deals high damage in combos, but that's more or less the only thing you can look forward to while playing him. He's incredibly linear, incredibly risky, and has few approaches that can't be nullified simply by movement or by good placement of jabs. The character is, for all intents and purposes, incredibly weak. I feel like the easiest way to describe Tekken 5 Dragunov is as a sort of proto-Dragunov, that the blueprint that his future iterations actually ended up becoming later. Because Tekken 5 Dragunov is missing plenty of things, and he has too many unreasonable gaps and weaknesses, that it seems more like he's the unfinished product of something incomplete, and not a fleshed out character design just yet. So, Dragunov spent his first entry in the Tekken franchise as a bit of a dud character. Weak, unsatisfying to play, so on and thus forth. So exactly how did they end up changing him and redesigning him in order to actually make him work in Tekken 6? To make this character design, which has some potential, and bring in some gameplay to actually have players be willing to play him? Well, it all stems from a change in coverage. The major weakness of Dragunov in Tekken 5 had more to do with the way his offense crumbled in the face of any kind of competent movement, and the fact that in their unrefined Tekken 5 state, many of his moves were just useless. Or, not particularly useless, but they were difficult to place onto an active opponent. Many of his moves had uses in theory, but in a real heated match, that theoretical use didn't really shine so much, and they needed to be adjusted so that they could actually serve their intended purpose. The first thing the designers did when attacking this quandary is speeding up some of the more sluggish strings and movements of Dragunov's toolkit. Doing this is very important because a seeable mix-up isn't bad because it's seeable. It's bad because it skews the risk and reward in favor of the person defending rather than the person doing the offense. And this can be intentional more often than not, but in regards to Dragunov strings, you could tell that it was not an intended weakness. Speeding up these moves serves more than a practical gameplay effect. It also sells the hits to you as a player, as a spectator. It makes these moves more convincing, and what they do to his opponent more readily apparent. That brings me to the example that sort of brings it all together as far as these animation changes are concerned, which is running 2. And I'll just let it speak for itself because seeing it side by side illustrates the point I'm going to make. Just comparing the impact frames of where Dragunov actually makes contact with his opponent, and you can see which one is sort of selling the moment better for you, and it's not the one from Tekken 5. A big part of the appeal of fighting games is how they can make the player feel powerful or competent, and they can do this in many different ways. Many games have varying levels of execution on their characters or just in general, and that's one way. But the visuals on screen are the co-pilot that sort of brings the entire experience together. Getting hit by a while running 2 in Tekken 5 was pretty dandy, all things considered, but in Tekken 6, you can really feel the pain you're imparting on your opponent, and it makes the character more fun to play. All of this talk even goes without mentioning the fact that the new WoW Running 2 is a counter hit launcher, and it's an iconic feature of the character at this point, since it's been a decade and a half since it's been introduced to Dragunov, but that also adds to the psychological element of making the character appealing to play. You get a lot of damage from a counter hit while running 2, and it even plays into the meta of your game plan. Your opponent doesn't want to get counter hit at any risk, at any cost, in any situation, because they know the risk. So these changes aren't the only ones Dragunov got in Tekken 6, and as much as I'd like to go on more and more about how punching someone really hard is extremely satisfying in a fighting game, there's actually more parts of this video I need to get to. So, a big part of the Tekken 6 changes, like I said previously, is a change of coverage. Many of his moves were rounded out and had their hitboxes adjusted so he can catch people stepping more often. These changes in coverage are substantial for the character, but they aren't all encompassing. He still has issues tracking sidestep left, and that's fine. Characters should have weaknesses, or at least they should be given some kind of counterplay so that you can actually maneuver around their toolkit whenever you're playing against them. Because a fighting game isn't a one-player game, and having effective counterplay makes it so that both players can interact on the same level, on the same sort of dimension as players. These changes are all specific to Dragunov in Tekken 6, but two universal changes that benefited every character in Tekken 6 benefited Dragunov quite drastically as well. The introduction of the bound system, or juggle extensions, as well as the introduction of homing moves, as in moves that specifically are purpose-built to track a sidestepping opponent. The bound system is the first example of a very controversial change within Tekken's systems. The other one is Rage. Coincidentally, they came in the same game. And the purpose of the bound system was to raise juggle damage universally across the cast, make it a little bit more, bring some more parity between individual characters when they get a launch. Obviously, this didn't happen. But The effort was there, and on the lower end, combo damage was raised quite a bit. So, what does Dragunov get specifically from this new bound mechanic? Does it do anything special for him? Well, from what I'm showing you, it doesn't really appear to. 70 is rather high for Tekken 6, yes, but it's not as high as you can really get. It's not at that threshold of ridiculousness. So let me show you an example of what is. Yeah, holy crap, am I right? Um, all it takes is a single counter hit, and you're taking more than 60% damage at once. Now, this is an exceptional circumstance, obviously, but you can sort of see what bounds do for Dragunov as a character. His game plan is to pressure you and push you into a corner so that his moves are more effective, and you're forced to take greater risks in order to get away from him. The bound system allows him to get a much greater reward when your back is actually against the wall. Like, little things like this can drastically change the way you approach a character, both as fighting against them and as the player, because you'll be extremely excited to get your opponent close to the wall, and your opponent will fight as much as they can to avoid being put in a situation like this in the first place. The introduction of true and honest homing moves means that Dragunov can apply his pressure even better when he's at wall. It's not just the threat of some kind of potential damage hitting you, whilst you getting wall splatted and taking some major hits. The homing move also makes you hesitant to actually interact with the 3D systems. If you get hit by a tracking move, then suddenly you're in the same situation but with less health and with Dragunov straight in your face, and that's in the best case situation if he uses a back 3. If Dragunov comes flying at you for forward 3, the move is rather slow, but if you're in the middle of a sidestep, there's not much you can do other than just watch it hit you, and watch your life bar disappear dramatically. Forward 3 as a move has many properties. It's a homing move, it's plus on block, it's a wall splat. Its primary fatal weaknesses are its slow startup, so it can't be used as a counter poke or a counter track in any way if your opponent's being proactive with their defense. And it's a high, so it can be ducked under. Let's go ahead and isolate one of those two weaknesses there. So it hits high. Think about that for a second. Dragunov is dashing up on you from mid-screen. You have the intuition to duck because you don't want to be trapped in another pressure situation by blocking this forward 3, this high attack. You can duck. What's the one thing you really don't want to do against Dragunov? What is a property of one of his most iconic moves that he's had since his first appearance? Yeah, that's right. Running 2 hits mid. So you can sort of see what the mind game here is and what the designers were going for with introducing this move to Dragunov's toolkit. In the future, we'll see that forward 3 is actually sort of a lead weight on Dragunov's ankle that makes him difficult to actually design around because of its many overlapping properties. But in this game, you can see what its inclusion actually does for the character and exactly what the game designers were going for with it. That about wraps up Tekken 6 Dragunov, and you can see that it's a drastic improvement from what Dragunov happened to be in Tekken 5. Many of his weak points have been mitigated somewhat, and there's still very significant counterplay to the character, however. He's still rather weak to sidewalk left. Many of his pokes sort of lack the same power of some other characters, and he still has no power lows to really speak of. He's still relying on down 2, as well as his low pokes and the strings associated with them in order to edge out victories against more skilled opponents. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but Tekken 6 is where the character starts to become his own actual creature, and Dragunov, as we know him today, is sort of created in Tekken 6. So, Drag is starting to look familiar to people who signed on to Tekken in Tekken 7. Or at least slightly more. There's still a few things missing. And before we actually get to Tekken 7, we're going to have to take a detour to another game, Tekken Tag Tournament 2, which is where more of the more identifiable traits of Drag's moveset were refined somewhat. Tekken Tag Tournament 2 is most certainly a short detour because the main thing every character got were combo extensions or more versatile juggle tools that could be figured into an opponent they had already launched. very few characters got reworked in such a way that their game plans changed to a significant degree. The main characters that changed to this significant degree are the OGs who hadn't appeared in quite a while, or characters who needed to have the way they interact with the bound system adjusted to be more consistent, because bounds are a more important part of Tekken Tag 2's combo system than in Tekken 6. Despite it being the main part in both games, it is heavily incentivized that you make use of the bound and the tag bound system in order to actually get victories in Tag 2. That, and I'm going to be completely honest, some characters had some really doo-doo bounds in Tekken 6, and these adjustments were just ways to bring them up to parity with the rest of the characters around them, rather than to buff the daylights out of other characters or something like that. It was all to just sort of to create balance in this new juggle system they made. Dragunov obviously wasn't excluded from this sort of combo enhancement that was adopted broadly across the cast. You get a whole new number of routes, new bound effects, new moves, so on and so forth, in order to make his juggle game a little bit more versatile and to give you more variety between players and what you were actually capable of within a combo. The key unifying factor for all of Dragunov's new routes is his brand new stance transition, which is forward 3 down forward, or forward 3 into sneak. It's difficult to understate just how important this transition actually is, because it becomes integral to Dragunov's identity, not just for combos, but in other ways going forward. Alright, fellas, and there's some ladies in the crowd, I'm assuming. There are a handful of ladies who play Tekken. Okay, I guess that's not here or there, but here we are on Tekken Tag Tournament 2, and I'm going to go ahead and illustrate something referring to Dragunov. Dragunov has a string mix-up. He gained it in Tekken 6 off of his forward 3 string. It's a high and a mid. Pretty straightforward mix-up. The mid's unsafe, the high is safe. There's enough of a gap to duck and punish the high, but that frees you up to the mid. Now there's an extra nuance to this. You can actually sidestep the mid in between, but this exposes you to the high in the exact same way. The high comes out fast enough to catch your step. So it's a pretty simple, straightforward mind game. Tekken Tag 2 gave Dragunov an additional option: the ability to cancel into his sneak stance, his crouch dash. This means that there's an extra layer of play that Dragunov can use in his pressure. It's very similar to what Lee or Brian can do with their crouch dash transitions. Brian has back 3, which you see from time to time as a way to create pressure and add to that mental stack that the Brian player is putting his opponent under. Now obviously this isn't strong on its own, but he can cancel it. And once I find Jun's dick jab, not down back, there we go, I can interrupt any successive attempts pretty easily. But because the crouch dash is part of Tekken's movement system, oh dear, that's a problem. So this cancel by itself, as well as the 2 enders, means that even making passive movements on defense carry a certain risk to them. So I could try and sidestep, but oh dear, he entered into sneak stance. Now I've given up the opportunity to interrupt him. Okay, I'm going to interrupt him instead. That should be the mid. Oh dear, I've been counter hit. Now this is a fairly low risk counter hit, but the point still stands. Instead, I'm tired of this. I have to get away, especially since my back's against the wall. How convenient. Oh dear, I've been hit. You can sort of see how this sort of elevates to the dimension of play with Dragunov as a character. The sneak cancel is very important and very integral for him going forward, and it was introduced on a side game many consider to be a failure. So let's go ahead and pause and get an overview on Dragunov at this point, before Tekken 7. Many of his very glaring gaps in Tekken 5, and many of those weaknesses that were overbearing, sort of over-encompassing of his overall game plan and play style and actual design in Tekken 5, have been sanded down a little bit. He still has a handful of weaknesses that carry over from all the way from his introduction to now, like his weakness to sidewalk left, and his lack of power lows and so on and thus forth, but they've been mitigated somewhat by new additions. He has a new slide out of Sneak that can be used as a round closer, or it's generally used as a round closer. It's just a low, you know? And he has a whole bevy of new whiff punishment options that are actually quite effective in and of themselves. Now, if you have fine trained eyes, or you're just actually looking at the text on screen, you notice an asterisk on both strong pressure and solid poking. And I'm going to have to show examples for this, but Dragunov, well, it's more glaring for him, but many characters have suspect hitboxes on some of their mids, as well as some of their lows, and it can be somewhat blatant with Dragunov, and I think that's because for many of these moves, even though the animation may have changed over the years, the hitboxes haven't, because there's been no necessity to change it. For like his running 2 hitbox, for example, might still be very similar to the Tekken 5 hitbox, despite everything at this point. Alright audience, we're back on Tag 2, and we're going to make use of the new record feature in defensive training, in order for me to show you a couple examples of just how weak to sidewalk left Dragunov really is. Dragunov's going to put me in plus frames, and I'm going to sidewalk left every option available here. And I'm going to do this one first, because I keep messing up the timing and needing to restart the recording. So let's hope for the best. You see what I mean? So, yeah, there we go. This is a little bit harder to get away from, and this is technically the option that catches sidestep left, but it doesn't handle sidewalk left. Now we can go in order. And you see how difficult it is for him to realign during the string. I can stop walking and still get away from the entire string. This is consistent in this game, and it's something that future games ended up changing by changing the way that strings actually realign a stepping opponent. That's really not an issue here now, though, so we can move on to the next example. There we go. I was mistiming it. I was about to say if I need a restart, but even one of his key pokes, down forward 1, is weak to sidewalk left. So now, Dragunov is going to overextend. And if I sidewalk, I get away. Again, it's a matter of timing, but yet again, he's weak to sidewalk left. With these examples in mind, you can see how important it is for things like tracking moves to exist, because it sort of limits the amount of variables at play whenever you're running your offense. It's easy to say that it simplifies things, because it does. If I need to stop you from stepping, instead of dashing to realign, I just have a catch-all move for it. Now, there's extra counterplay to this. Since it's a high, I can sidestep and duck, and then punish you. But that's the purpose of this move. Back on Tag 2 again, something I forgot to mention about Tag 2 in particular, partially because it's a combo-focused game, and some counter hits in the previous games were sort of goofy. I forgot to mention that Dragunov lost a handful of counter hit launchers as time went on, in Tekken 7 specifically, because I just used this move on a whim and I was like, wow, that's goofy. Probably not necessary. Just looking at it makes me giggle a little bit. But yeah, just keep that in mind. And this isn't something that affected Dragunov. Tag 2 was a sort of wild game in terms of move hit effects, especially on counter hit, and especially in regards to potential launches. Yeah, just wanted to say that as well. I'm 110% serious about it being every character. Look at this shit with Eddie. You're like seriously. There's so many characters lost wacky counter hit launchers for obvious reasons. I don't know why they have them. Some of these didn't exist in Tekken 6. Alright, well, that concludes part 1 of my drag retrospective. This project is a lot longer coming than I thought it would be, because once I actually dug into the history of the character and his competitive viability, at least on paper, this is still rather surface level because this is the perspective of one person within the lab actually testing out the character's effectiveness within a theoretical framework. Um, Drag wasn't particularly popular in 6 or 5. Even though he could still perform well, he appeared from time to time in Tekken Crash, and there's an old clips of Eris beating up some Asian players from back in the day. Avoiding the puddle, if you're not familiar with him, he used to be a Tekken player before he went variety mode. But that's ancient history, and it's irrelevant to the point I'm making right now. All of this sort of theory crafting and surface level stuff still is sort of on the shallow end of things. And going through these pre-Unreal Engine games took up a good grip of time already, and there's a lot more to be said about Tekken 7 and especially Tekken 8, because Tekken 7 is over and done with, but Tekken 8 drag is sort of indicative of the design processes and where I sort of disagree with the game designers and the developers behind the scenes with where they're taking Tekken as a franchise and where they're taking these characters as well. So splitting this into parts is significantly smarter just for the sake of making the information more digestible. This video by itself is already a doozy. So I think that about wraps up what I need to say. I hope to see you in the next video when I eventually get it out. Yeah, just stay groovy and be on the lookout.